Hi everyone, welcome to our first talk in the summer series webinars. Our speaker today is Thomas Banbury. He's a PhD candidate at the Department of History and Philosophy of Science, Cambridge University, and an AHRC doctoral scholar at Selwyn College. His research deals with the perceptions and representations of air and the atmosphere in late medieval, early modern philosophy of medicine. And he convenes the Cabinet of Natural History Seminar and is co-founder of the Atmospheric Humanities Reading Group. Welcome to the webinar, Thomas.
Thank you very much, Ari, and thank you to Curtis as well for reaching out to arrange this. I'm very excited to speak to you all this afternoon. So I'll just go ahead and share my screen. There we go. You all see that all right?
Yep.
Splendid. So, the theory of thought corresponds to meteorology, or so wrote the German poet Novalis in the closing years of the 18th century. At the time, he was engaged in writing notes towards a projected romantic encyclopedia, left unfinished at his death in 1801. And his invocation of the science of the weather was a particularly powerful one. It's at the turn of the 19th century that Vladimir Yankovic identifies the end of classical meteorology, the science of the skies based on Aristotle's eponymous text, and its replacement with a sort of quantized instrumental methods of predictive physical meteorology, the end of one of the oldest traditions of knowledge and the birth of one of the earliest self-contained disciplines. The belief that there should have been a connection between the workings of the brain and the workings of the heavens put Novalis in a long line of literary and cultural thought. Thomas H. Ford has argued that Wordsworth and other Romantic poets injected a particularly atmospheric and meteorological sensibility into their writings, with foggy and misty scenes precipitating in the minds of poets, painters, and political thinkers in the last decades of the 18th century. Preternatural storms rack the 16th century Scottish landscape in Macbeth. As the nature of both king and kingdom become destabilized, the chain of events set off by the arrival of the three witches through the fog and filthy air. Going back even further, the literary scholar Geoffrey Cohen has investigated how in much of early Middle English literature, spirits are lifted or depressed by interface of humans with their atmosphere. Air, he says, is the enmeshment of life with environment. In this presentation, I'd like to introduce you to a particular section of a late medieval epic poem, and then trace its intellectual genealogy back to its sources, and then read this new context forward again into the work. By doing so, I'd like to suggest that there was an abiding and rational connection between the human mind and weather in pre-modern thought, one based not only on the deep analogical reasoning which permeated the mental worlds of people across the high and later medieval period, but also derived from the complex mechanisms of natural philosophy and medicine. So, though the context for this presentation ranges widely across Latin and vernacular writings in Western Europe, the focus is going to be on John Gower's Middle English epic, the Confessio Amantis, and in particular, Book 7. Completed in around 1390, the Confessio, or in English, the Lover's Confession, has 8 books in total and is framed as the confession of the title lover, Amans, to Genius, the designated priest of Venus. 7 of the 8 books, books 1 to 6 and then book 8, deal in turn with one of the 7 cardinal sins. The lovesick Amans confesses his slights against courtly love according to each theme, and Genius offers him moral exemplar from history, scripture, and mythology. Book 7, on the other hand, is a speculum principium, or a mirror for princes. It offers an extended discussion on the virtues of good governance as handed down to Alexander the Great by his tutor Aristotle. The precise meaning of this book, which gives a rhyming summary of mathematics, logic, astronomy, and geography, amongst other things, has long been debated. So George C. Macaulay, the first editor of Gower's complete works, calls the book absolutely irrelevant, while more recent editors, such as Russell Peck, have instead called Book 7 the most important book in the Confessio. Gower divides his philosophical material according to an Aristotelian scheme, taken from almost directly from the popular French encyclopedia by Brunetto Latini, called Le Livre du Trésor, or the Book of the Treasure, written in the 1260s. His scheme has 3 parts: theoretic, rhetoric, and practic. We find Gower's meteorology filed under physic, and specifically within his description of the elements. Gower spends 189 lines describing the properties of the four classical elements of earth, water, air, and fire. He devotes 120 lines, more than 60% of this, to discussing the air and its phenomena. Meteorology then therefore makes up almost a third of his entire treatment of the physical sciences. These numbers might only account for a small portion of Book 7 overall. However, if we accept the argument that Gower was as concerned with structure and balance as literary scholars such as Robert Yeager say he is, then what is the significance of expending more lines on the air than any of the other three elements combined? And what does knowledge of this highly technical branch of natural philosophy contribute to the formation of the ideal ruler? So, to begin with, what does Gower tell us about his meteorology? Firstly, he doesn't call it that, although the disciplinary focus of this section would have been clear to most contemporary readers. For medieval scholars working in the tradition of Aristotle, Seneca, and Pliny, the science of meteorology encompassed not only storms and rain clouds, but extended up to the sphere of the moon to embrace the study of comets and meteors, and down into the caverns of the earth to explain the origins of earthquakes and minerals. It offers an almost comprehensive account of sublunary phenomena, that is to say, all affairs which take place below the sphere of the moon, and which separated the incorruptible lower world from the corruptible lower world from the incorruptible heavens of the planets and fixed stars. Gower is by no means the first medieval writer to include meteorological details in his writings. Geoffrey Cohen, as mentioned, has made an extended analysis of the heavy atmospheres, as he calls them, of Chaucer's The Reeve's Tale, while Jean de Meun's Romance of the Rose is replete with cloud bursts and shooting stars, and earlier, the personification of the virtues in Alan of Leal's Anti-Claudianus must navigate through the turbulent skies on their way to heaven. However, Gower's meteorology is unique both for its length, as we've discussed, dwarfing the other three elements in this section of Book 7, and in its level of technical detail. Gower starts by putting the atmosphere in its context, above the first two elements of earth and water. It then divides it into three distinct layers, in accordance with most scholastic commentaries by people like Thomas Aquinas or Albert the Great. Deploying a range of technical vocabulary, he calls these divisions peripheries. So we can see here some of the more technical language he's using, peripheries or interstitiums, each of which have characteristic impressions or phenomena caused by either of two substances. These substances are the drivers of Aristotle's weather system, as outlined in the Meteorologica. So there's the damp, misty vapor, known in Greek as atmos, from whence we get the word atmosphere in English, and then the dry, fiery exhalation, known as anathumiasis. The misty vapor is produced from water on the surface of the earth, drawn up by the heat of the sun. This concept is fairly recognizable to us as like the hydrological cycle. However, less familiar is the concept of the dry exhalation, warm, earthy particles, which are temperamentally dry and flammable, which arise from the earth itself. So, using these three peripheries as a structure, Gower takes us through the different meteorological phenomena that we can expect to find in each. The first region, or the first periphery, he says, engendreth mists and overmore the dewers and the frostes hoar. So mists, dew, and hoarfrost. This is produced by the water vapor condensing on the Earth's surface. The second middle region is where the moist drops of the rain descend into Middle Earth. According to different circumstances of temperature in this cooler region, the rain may be turned either into snow or into hail. But the highest region is too hot for clouds to condense, being next to the friction of the whirling spheres of the stars. Only the dry, fiery exhalation can be found here, which catches fire in various forms to produce fire, light, and thunder, and other fiery atmospheric phenomena. A huge number of strange apparitions, such as the aurora borealis, rainbows, or double or triple suns, were discussed in the province of meteorology. But it was the fiery phenomena which seems to have captured the most attention. It comes across in a huge range of medieval and early modern texts. They could be found in chronicles produced by various cities and municipalities, works of natural history, political or religious texts and predictions, and stories of mirabilia or wondrous things published in pamphlet form throughout early modern Europe. In his 1563 Book of Natural Marvels entitled A Goodly Gallery, William Fulke gives descriptions of dancing or leaping goats, burning spears, fiery dragons, and the ignis fatuus, or will-o'-the-wisp, as different forms of these burning vapours which might be seen in the sky. The learned interpretation of these phenomena was that they were all forms of the same material, as Gower had said. They differed in appearance based on purity, temperature, size, and shape of the flammable exhalations gathered in the atmosphere. So Gower then gives us an account of 4 of these types of atmospheric fire. Asub, or Asub, a falling star which leaves a sort of slimy residue. Capra saliens, which means leaping goats, a flame which looks like a leaping goat. Eges, which looks like, according to him, like a flammable cord. And Dali, which he says looks like a dragon brennenden, or burning in the sky. He specifies that these all have the same material cause, i.e. the dry exhalation, but that they only seemeth to be different. Compared to the very orderly layout of the watery impressions in the lower regions, Gower's fiery phenomena are somewhat confused. He misapplies labels from different sources to his descriptions and presents a slim selection of only the most dramatic fiery phenomena. For example, he describes the fiery impression known as the leaping goats, calling them capra saliens, as we can see here, but then distinguishes another form, which he calls eges, a term he takes from Aristotle, but in Greek this also means goat, even though he describes it as like a burning cord. Equally, in Aristotle, the phenomena called daloi look like burning torches in the sky, and not at all like the dragon from Gower's Dali. Precisely why this section is so disordered in comparison is debatable, although it seems that Gower's overall point is that these phenomena all have the same material substrate, but differ in form according to different temperamental admixtures, specific temperatures, and the amount of exhalation that have been gathered in one place. As he said, of exhalation I find fire kindled of another kind, but it is of another form. The majority of Gower's natural philosophy, as we've discussed, is drawn directly from Brunetto's Livre de Trousseur, but not so with his discussion of the air and his meteorology. Brunetto gives only a cursory and well-known description of this elemental region, excerpting bits from Isidore of Seville, Constantine the African, and others. However, his meteorology doesn't come close to Gower's in its level of technical detail or its language, with no discussion of the 3 layers or peripheries, which are so central to Gower's account. Gower must therefore have looked elsewhere to fill in this section of his poem, having found Brunetto's work insufficient in some respect. So, here's where my thinking comes in. I believe that Gower drew on a much older source, an early 13th century commentary on a 12th century poem. The poem in question is Alan Vleal's Anti-Claudianus, which is a deeply allegorical Platonic meditation on the relationship between the Christian soul and the cosmos. The poem was written in the 1180s, and by the 1210s, one of Alan's students, called Ralph of Longchamps, had composed a treatise entitled In Anti-Claudianum Aleni Commentum, which just means commentary on the Anti-Claudianus of Alan. Ralph's was not a commentary in the traditional sense. Instead of explaining the allegorical meanings of the passages, he set about explaining the poem's wide-ranging subject matter, with long discussions on mathematics, philosophy, theology, and music. In many ways, Ralph's commentary is on the Anti-Claudianus reads more like an idiosyncratic encyclopedia, which rejects traditional structures based either on the scale of nature or on the 7 liberal arts, or even some of the sort of nascent alphabetizing impulses, and instead hangs its information very loosely on quotations from the Latin poem. Anti-Claudianus concerns the creation and then education of the perfect soul by various personifications of nature and the different virtues. Prudentia, or prudence, sometimes called phronesis, is sent on an embassy to God to obtain the soul, and Alan then introduces other personifications that contribute to educating this new perfect man, which in some interpretations is meant to be Christ. For his discussion of meteorology, Ralph focuses on a short passage in Book 2 of Anti-Claudianus, where Phronesis's knowledge of the natural world is described, saying that she knows what confines rain in clouds, why the air rumbles, and what gives rise to winds, what instills them with rage. So he elucidates these questions with chapters entitled things such as what is thunder and how is it made, and what are clouds. Most interestingly for our purposes, chapter 10 of the second part of the commentary is titled De tribus interstitiis qui sunt in aere, or on the 3 divisions which are in the air, which, as you'll be able to see from here, matches very closely with our rubric in the manuscript of the Confessio Mantis, so nota qualita aer in tribus peripheris dividitur. So similar, different language, but similar aspect. So there are several close textual and conceptual similarities which suggest that Gower had access to Ralph's text in some form. Ralph calls the division of the atmosphere interstitia, meaning gap or space, rather than peripheria. However, in his description of the first layer of the atmosphere, Gower does also use this term, suggesting perhaps where he says, after Thilk interstition, in which they take impression. Gower only uses the term once, however, he only uses the word periphery twice, perhaps suggesting that he doesn't have a particularly strong preference for one over the other. There might also be a more prosaic reason for this, in that Gower was writing in very strict octosyllabic lines, and so he might just prefer one word in different metrical contexts. Gower follows Ralph closely in the actual description of the three regions, where Gower's first periphery contains mist, dews, and frosted hoar. Ralph's contains rores, pruina, et nebula, so dew, hoarfrost, and mist. Gower's second region is the origin of rain, snow, and hail. For Ralph, these are aqua, nix, and grando, so water in the sense of rain, water, and then snow and hail, just in Latin. The major difference is in the top layer of the atmosphere. In Gower, the highest layer is where the thunder, light, and fire can be found. However, Ralph believes that there is nothing in the very top layer, and specifically says the heat of the sphere, fire, which is just above, doesn't allow anything to form, vapors or otherwise. Ralph includes three other phenomena, namely the tonitrua coruscationes et fulmina, that is thunder, fiery flashes or sparks, and lightning, but only in the upper part of the second layer, rather than in the third layer proper. This is most likely because Ralph considers clouds necessary for the generation of thunder and lightning, which he believes is fire just trapped within clouds that make a sort of rumbling noise, and he thus restricts them to the highest level. I would argue that the reason for this difference is that Gower considered it probably neater in a rhetorical and aesthetic sense to have an atmosphere of three parts with three distinctive phenomena, each rather than Ralph's system of three regions, one with two subregions, with 9 phenomena distributed unevenly between them. So Gower probably had access, as I've argued, to Ralph's literary encyclopedia and preferred his technical account of meteorology to the one he found in Brunetto's work, and chose to translate, adapt, and reshape the material for this part of Book 7. This is a huge intellectual labour when we consider that he already had access to an account of meteorology in the form of Brunetto's work. So why was it so important to get this area of his book correct? A possible answer, I believe, may lie in the context in which Ralph's meteorology itself appears. Among the chapters on clouds, rainbows, and other phenomena like that, Ralph was particularly interested in the nature of the senses, and in particular, what the nature of dreams is. Dreams held a really special place in medieval intellectual culture, partly for their role in religious mysticism and revelation, and partly as a key framing narrative in literature. Chaucer's Book of the Duchess, House of Fame, and Parliament of Fowls, and William Langland's Piers Plowman, so all of the major sort of standard texts of Middle English, or at least Ricardian Latin literature, all recount dream visions. Dreams were a major topic in the Aristotelian natural philosophy, revived in the medieval period, particularly as they disrupted the concept of the reliability of the senses. Ralph's account of sleep and dreams closely follows that of Aristotle, with some minor changes. As Aristotle established in his work on sleep and wakefulness, sleep is brought about as a byproduct of digestion, as we can see here from the different organs of the body from Gregor Reich's Margarita Philosophica. During digestion, in which in the received account of Aristotelian Hippocratic medicine is brought about by the innate heat of the stomach, the digestion of food produces a sort of thin, hot vapor. Albert the Great, in his commentary on Aristotle, calls this the spiritus, and says they're transported to various organs like the liver and the heart and become more specialized. These digestive vapors naturally rise to the head, being warm and light, where the coolness of the brain causes them to condense. They descend again through the body, drawing with them the natural heat of the sensitive organs, and thus bringing about sleep. This lasts until digestion is complete, and the innate heat is restored, at which point the sleep will picks up. The similarity of the cyclical process to the water cycle was not lost on ancient readers. Indeed, Aristotle says in his text that the condensing of these vapors in the head is a physical analogy to the evaporation and condensation of water in the atmosphere. The classicist Friedrich Thomson has commented that it is unclear whether the cyclical model of rising and falling vapors was developed first in meteorology or in physiology by the ancient Greeks. So Ralph and many other scholastic philosophers were eager readers of Aristotle's texts on sleep and dreams. And in his commentary on Anti-Claudianus, there is a full account of these vapors moving within the body. Other writers also picked up on the close analogy between these two vaporous cycles. In his 1230 commentary on Aristotle's text on sleep and wakefulness, the English scholastic Adam of Buckfield takes the analogy a step further, as you can see from the Latin translations on the screen. The analogy describing the digestive vapors as being thickened into a cloud by the coolness of the brain, just as happens with humid vapors in the middle region of the air. This is almost a direct quotation from Aristotle. However, Aristotle writes that the condensation of the watery vapors happens high in the atmosphere. Adam has corrected the statement with his knowledge of meteorology. According to the received account that we've just had from Gower, the highest level of the atmosphere is too hot for anything to form. And so Adam corrects this view by saying that they form in the middle region of the atmosphere. Apparently, the medieval brain could quite literally generate its own fog. Ralph offers us an account of the formation of dreams as well, closely linked to the material conditions which bring about sleep. In chapter 21 of his commentary, Ralph tells us there are 5 types of dreams, which I've put on the screen here. Oraculum, Visio, Somnium, Insomnium, and Phantasma. Though only the first 3 of these are worthy of any sort of interpretation. This is also the scheme that Chaucer recounts in his House of Fame, completed in about 1385, where he says he knows why that is a vision, why this a revelation, why this is a dream, why that is sweven, was another term for insomnia, sort of nightmare, and not to every man like even. Why this a phantom, these oracles I know. While oracles, visions, and dreams may result from the exaggeration of minor sensory impressions detected in sleep, and therefore do bear some relationship to reality, though not excluding the possibility of supernatural interventions, both phantasms and insomnium, or nightmares, he says, are vain, and their interpretation is unbecoming, according to Macrobius. While nowadays we might think of dreams as having a narrative, even a confused one, this property was reserved only for the first 3 types of dreams. Insomnium and phantasma, more akin to sort of random objects, images, or scenes which appear in the mind's eye. These dreams were considered non-signifying because they result from the chance formation of vapors in the brain. Because these vapors originated in digestion, they have the individual humoral complexions, depending on the nature of the food being digested. This is a slightly strange idea, but bear with me. As such, Ralph tells us eating phlegmatic foods, which are temperamentally cold and moist, such as pork, is the example he gives, will produce a particularly phlegmatic vapor. This phlegmatic vapor will in turn give rise to dreams of watery and rainy scenes. We find this view repeated in the 14th century encyclopedist Bartholomeus Anglicus. In the Middle English translation of his book on the properties of things, completed a few years after Gower's Confessio, we can read that those with a phlegmatic constitution have swevens, that is, dreams, of great waters and snows, and of rain, and of sailing on cooled waters, and of swimming therein. Alternately, those who eat temperamentally hot foods, such as garlic and onions, will have violent and fiery dreams. Those whose humours are corrupted or rotten will, according to Ralph, have dreams of walking through filthy or dung-filled places. He used the word stercosa, it's all very vivid. Much fear was attached to the abundance of the melancholic humour in particular. Melancholics have the most vivid imaginations, as the smoky black bile depresses the mood and gives rise to feelings of impending doom, as well as producing in the brain various lines and figures, according to Ralph, which give rise to the oppressive sensation of what he calls the ephialtes, so we might translate this as incubus, the sense of the sort of sleep paralysis. In all cases, the connection between these digestive vapors and different sorts of dreams is clear. Returning to Bartholomeus, we read that the smoke that is than resolved and departeth maketh new impressions and printings in the brain, and thereof cometh unlike and diverse swevens. So basically, the smoke, the fumes from digestion create strange images in the brain that are unlike anything that you might find in nature. I would like to suggest that to the medieval mind, these humorally inflected vapors and vaporous dreams and the various forms of atmospheric fire could be closely analogized. A wide variety of different types of dreams could be induced depending on their humoral quality, quantity, and temperature of the vapors circulating around the brain. Equally, the diversity of fiery meteors were the result of different conditions, purity, shape, and temperature prevailing in the massive dry exhalations that we find in the upper atmosphere. So in medieval thought, the vaporous processes of the brain, the nature of dreams, sensations, and sleep were naturally analogous to the processes of the atmosphere. In a worldview so deeply inflected by the analogy of the microcosm to the macrocosm, dreams can be read as the meteors of the mind and vice versa. One of Ralph's primary concerns when describing the formation of dreams is to distinguish those that have some sort of signification from those that are merely accidental. By explaining their origins, the two sorts of meaningless dreams can be identified, and thus we can avoid interpretation which he says is unbecoming. This was made particularly necessary by the importance of dreams in religious revelation. Bartholomeus Anglicus cites the divinely inspired dreams of both the Pharaoh and Jacob in Genesis as examples of dreams that have particular signification. The medieval genre of dream books gathered together all manner of prophetic images that appeared within dreams, with appropriate glosses and interpretations. Ralph is clear in his description of the incubus, or the Ephialtes from the Melancholic Humour, that it is only held by public opinion that the spirit invades the sleeper, whereas in reality it is the product of internal vapours, he says this with a slightly derisive tone. Through proper knowledge of physiology and the natural causes of these phenomena, vain and unbecoming prognostication could be avoided. Can the same be said of the fiery meteors, though? Well, in the vernacular French epic, The Romance of the Rose, begun in 1230 and completed by a different author in about 1275, we find a similar sentiment. As the literary scholar Philip Knox has argued, The Romance of the Rose was a major influence on English literature in the centuries after its composition, partly as the literary culture of England in the 13th and 14th centuries still had Anglo-Norman, or Norman French in particular, as a prestige language. Similar to Allen's Anti-Claudianus from a century before, The Romance of the Rose is densely allegorical and encyclopedic in its themes, and like the Confessio, its principal matter is the proper philosophy of love. Like all great medieval literature, the Romance is populated by personifications of abstract concepts such as nature or reason, as well as a slew of pagan gods such as Cupid. Towards the end of the poem, the part written by the French troubadour Jean de Meun, the character of nature gives her confession. Yeah, you can see that. In which she describes her distress at how humans have misunderstood the divinely ordained workings of nature. In particular, she describes how foolish people, which she calls, as you can see here, les folles gens, interpret comets and shooting stars as portents of the deaths of princes. Nature makes the compelling argument that if all men were equal and there were no rulers, would these phenomena still appear? Indeed, she says, these are the celestial bodies which make flying dragons and sparks appear in the air, resembling stars falling from heaven, as the foolish people understand them to be. The emphasis in this whole passage of the Romance of the Rose is that the world, as created by God and attended to by nature, works in perfect accord with the principles of physics, with most events, even the most spectacular, requiring no special supernatural intervention. It is only the credulity and superstition of men that gives it a chaotic aspect. With the proper understanding of the laws of nature, we can avoid reading omens and portents into perfectly natural accidents. With this new context, what do we gain by reading this forward into Gower's meteorology? If Gower did have access to Ralph's In Anti-Claudianum Aleni Commentum, which I argue did, then he seemed only interested in the meteorological portions. George Fox, who was one of the earliest historians of science to examine the works of Gower, argues that there is no evidence that Gower entertained a scientific theory of dream causation, and the several dreams recounted in the Confessio as exemplary tales all follow from the instigation of the supernatural power. However, this does not mean that Gower was unfamiliar with the prevailing intellectual trend, which placed dreams and meteors on the same epistemological footing. Both phenomena result from the sort of aleatoric accretion of vapours, themselves imperfect mixtures without a final cause, at least in Aristotelian terms. Because of the unstable and unpredictable nature of its material constituents, the historian Craig Martin has argued that meteorology remained a region of only probable knowledge well into the Renaissance. Let us then read Gower's meteorology as a cautionary science. Like dreams, they may well be signs from God, but it is important to know the difference. Just as Ralph derides the account of the incubus as a product of public opinion, and Jean de Meun has nature criticized the foolish people, Gower has his own term for the credulous. In describing the fiery figure of the dragon, Gower says, and we can see it here, sometimes the fire drake it seemeth, and so the lured people deemeth. Sometimes it seemeth, as it were, a star that glideth there, but it is neither of the two, so the philosopher telleth so. This in turn provides an explanation for Gower's extended treatment of meteorology and his mining of Ralph's work for information. Considering book 7 of the Confessio as a mirror for princes, the ability to distinguish between divine portents from natural accidents is clearly valuable. It explains the difference between the forms of the fiery phenomena. The conditions and location of their origin are all important, especially to distinguish false falling stars from the real stars, which Gower believes do govern the fates of nations through astrology. This explains why Gower borrows the more detailed structure of the three peripheries from Ralph, rather than relying solely on Brunetto. The three-layer structure draws the distinction more clearly between the higher parts of the sublunary world, where these corruptible comets appear, and the incorruptible regions of the heavens. So I would like to suggest, therefore, that to the medieval mind, the mechanisms of spectacle both in the brain and in the heavens were analogous. Writers such as Albert the Great, Ralph of Longchamps, and later on John Gower envisaged a role for natural philosophy, which complemented rather than disproved supernatural interventions in phenomena. Knowledge of meteorology and of Hippocratic medicine allowed the wise man to sift omens from accidents, preserving the role of God and the angels in putting nature to work as a communicative medium. For the reader of Gower's Meteorology and of Book 7 in general, this knowledge is what separates the lured people from the wise man, or so the philosopher telleth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for your fascinating and fresh take on the relationship between meteorology and literature. Thank you so much.
Thank you.